The ocean has a memory, long and cold. That day, it chose to remember a buried secret, delivering a gruesome package into my fishing net that shattered the quiet peace of Port Blossom. The sea doesn't keep secrets. Not really. It spits them back up, sooner or later. My father taught me that, his voice as rough as the barnacles on the pier. He said the ocean has a memory, and it's longer and colder than any man's. I've lived in Port Blossom my whole life, all 47 years of it, and I've seen the sea give back lost anchors, shattered planks from boats long gone, and once a message in a bottle from a kid in a town 200 miles up the coast. But I'd never seen it give back something like this. Never. My boat, the Sea Serpent, is more rust than paint these days, but she's sturdy. She was my father's before she was mine, and his father's before him. We know the currents around here like the lines on our own palms. We know where the cod run in the spring and where the crabs hide when the storms roll in. It's a life of routine, governed by the tides and the sky. You wake before the sun, you smell the salt and the diesel. You feel the familiar ache in your shoulders as you cast the nets, and you hope for a good haul. It's simple, it's honest, or at least it was. That morning was no different. A thick, pearly fog clung to the water, muffling the world in a blanket of grey. The gulls were quiet, their usual raucous cries swallowed by the mist. I liked mornings like this. It felt like it was just me and the sea, a silent understanding between two old souls. I'd motored out to my usual spot, a couple of miles off the coast, where a deep channel promised a decent catch. The engine sputtered to a low grumble as I cut the power, the rhythmic creak and slap of the boat against the gentle swell becoming the only sound in the world. I cast my nets, the heavy mesh flying out in a practiced arc before sinking into the murky depths. Then I waited. I drank my coffee from a dented thermos, the hot liquid a welcome warmth against the morning chill. The fog began to thin, revealing the jagged silhouette of the coastline and the sleepy cluster of houses that made up Port Blossom. From out here it looked peaceful, idyllic even, a place untouched by time. But I knew better. In a town this small, everyone's business is everyone's history. Secrets are a currency, and grudges can be passed down through generations just like fishing boats. Still, it was home. After a few hours, it was time. I fired up the winch, the diesel engine groaning to life. The ropes went taut, straining as the hydraulic motor began its slow, powerful work of hauling the net from the deep. Right away, something felt wrong. The strain was immense, far heavier than any school of cod or haul of crab. It was a dead weight, a stubborn, unyielding mass that made the winch motor whine in protest. "Come on, you old girl," I muttered to the boat, my hands gripping the rail. My first thought was a snag, a piece of wreckage, maybe a submerged log, or worse, an old ghost net that had tangled with mine. That was always the fear. A torn net could cost me a week's earnings, a month's if it was bad enough. The rope vibrated with the tension, and I could feel the deep, dragging pull through the very deck beneath my feet. Slowly, painstakingly, the net began to surface. It broke the water in a chaotic mess. It wasn't a log. It was a colossal tangle of seaweed, old ropes, and ocean debris, all balled up into one giant, dripping clump. My heart sank. This was going to take hours to clear, and half the catch would be crushed and worthless. I grunted with frustration, grabbing a gaff hook to start pulling the mess apart. Chunks of kelp and slimy green algae slopped onto the deck, releasing a foul, stagnant smell of decay that was different from the clean scent of the sea. I worked methodically, untangling strands of rotten rope and tossing aside mangled crabs and starfish. It was a miserable job. The weight was still concentrated in the center of the net, a solid, dense core that refused to break apart. As I peeled back another layer of thick brown seaweed, I saw a flash of pale white. My first thought was a mannequin. It happens sometimes. Trash gets dumped illegally offshore, and you pull up all sorts of strange things. A doll's head, a plastic limb. It was always eerie, but this looked different, more organic. I hesitated for a second, a strange prickle of unease running down my spine. The fog had completely burned off now, and the sun was glinting off the water, but a sudden chill had nothing to do with the weather. I told myself to stop being stupid and get on with it. I reached in with my gloved hands and pulled at the last thick curtain of kelp. It came away with a wet, sucking sound. And there it was. It wasn't a mannequin. It was a hand. A human hand, severed cleanly at the wrist. The skin was waterlogged and bleached a ghostly, wrinkled white, but it was unmistakably human. The fingers were slightly curled, as if reaching for something. My breath hitched in my throat. The world seemed to tilt, the gentle rocking of the boat suddenly feeling violent and nauseating. My mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It was a prop. It had to be. A Halloween decoration. But the reality of it was undeniable. The way the light caught the faint blue of the veins beneath the pale skin, the perfect shape of the fingernails, now chipped and discolored. My coffee churned in my stomach. I stumbled back, my boots slipping on the slimy deck. I hit the far rail of the boat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The gaff hook clattered from my numb fingers. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It just lay there nestled in the green and brown mess of the net, a grotesque and silent accusation. And then I screamed. It wasn't a shout for help. It was a raw, primal sound, ripped from the very depths of my soul, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. It tore through the calm morning air, carrying across the flat, glassy water. It was a sound that didn't belong in the daylight. I heard it echo back from the cliffs on the shore, a thin, desperate wail that bounced across the water and straight into the open windows of the village. Every soul in Port Blossom would have heard it. My body was shaking uncontrollably. I forced myself to take a breath, then another. I had to do something. I couldn't just leave it there. I couldn't throw it back. That felt like a crime, worse than the one that had already been committed. Slowly, cautiously, as if it might spring to life, I edged closer. That's when I saw it. On the third finger, the ring finger, was a simple, thin band of gold, dulled by its time in the water. My gaze fixed on it. A wedding ring. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a body part. This was part of a person. Someone's husband. Someone's father. With a trembling hand, I reached out, my fingers barely brushing against the cold, clammy skin. I had to be sure. I had to see. Using the tip of my thumb, I wiped away a bit of the grime clinging to the inside of the gold band. There, almost hidden, were the faint, tiny etchings of an inscription. I squinted, my heart pounding in my ears, blocking out the sound of the waves. I could just make out two letters, intertwined in an elegant script, T and M, and next to them, a date. My entire world stopped. The air left my lungs in a painful rush, and a cold dread, deeper and more terrifying than anything I had ever known, washed over me. Because I knew that inscription. I had seen it before, years ago, at a wedding. The hand in my net, the hand wearing that ring. It belonged to Thomas Miller, my neighbor. And Thomas Miller hadn't been seen in over a year, not since the night his wife, Maria, claimed he packed a bag and left her for a woman on the mainland. My mind was a roaring, empty cavern. Thomas and Maria, T&M, they'd married just 2 years ago, down by the old lighthouse. The whole village was there. I remembered the day clearly. The sun was bright, the wind was gentle. Thomas had been so nervous his hands were shaking when he slid that exact ring onto Maria's finger. No, wait, that wasn't right. He slid the ring onto her finger. His own ring, the one I was staring at now, had been placed on his hand by Maria. I remembered her smiling, a wide, brilliant smile that seemed to outshine the sun itself. She'd been a newcomer to Port Blossom, arriving a few years prior from the city, a whirlwind of bright clothes and loud laughter that stood in stark contrast to our weathered, quiet ways. Thomas, a man as steady and predictable as the tides, had been utterly bewitched by her. Then, a year ago, he was gone. Maria had been distraught. She'd stood in the middle of the village square, tears streaming down her face, clutching a letter she claimed Thomas had left on the pillow. He'd run off, she'd sobbed, with some woman he'd met on a supply run to the city. He was sorry, but he'd found a new life, and he wasn't coming back. We'd all felt for her. We'd brought her casseroles and offered sympathies. We'd cursed Thomas's name, calling him a fool and a coward for leaving a woman like Maria, for abandoning the sea, for turning his back on the only home he'd ever known. It was a scandal that kept the town talking for months, but a lie. It had all been a lie. The engine of the sea serpent coughed to life with a turn of the key, the sudden roar of the diesel, an obscene violation of the tomb-like silence that had fallen over the boat. I had to get back. I had to tell someone. The hand... I couldn't just leave it rolling around on the deck. With a wave of nausea, I grabbed an old canvas sack I used for bait. My own hands were trembling so badly I could barely work the knots. I gently, reverently picked up the hand and placed it inside. It felt wrong, sacrilegious. Tying the sack closed, I set it carefully in a bait cooler, snapping the lid shut. It felt like closing a coffin. The journey back to shore was the longest 2 miles of my life. The sea serpent felt like it was moving through tar. Every wave that slapped against the hull sounded like a whisper. Every cry of a distant gull sounded like an accusation. The sea was no longer my provider, my old friend. It was a crime scene, a vast, unmarked grave. My mind raced, replaying every interaction I'd had with Maria over the past year. Her grief had seemed so real at first, but then it had changed. It had hardened into a kind of brittle anger, and then, more recently, into a serene, almost triumphant self-sufficiency. She'd taken over Thomas's share in the local fish market, handling the books with a shrewdness no one knew she possessed. She'd repainted their little cottage, a cheerful, sunny yellow, a stark contrast to the muted blue Thomas had always preferred. She'd planted a garden full of blood-red roses that won a prize at the county fair. Everyone said how well she was holding up, how strong she was. Looking back now, it wasn't strength I saw. It was something else. Something cold. As the docks of Port Blossom came into view, I could see a small crowd gathered at the end of my slip. My scream had done its work. Old Man Hemlock was there, cupping a hand over his eyes to peer out at me. The Jensen brothers, their own boats already tied up, stood with their arms crossed, whispering. They weren't looking at my boat with the usual casual interest of fellow fishermen sizing up a rival's haul. They were looking with fear. They knew a scream like that meant something was terribly wrong. I cut the engine and glided into the slip, my hands working the ropes with a mechanical precision that belied the chaos raging inside me. Before anyone could even ask, I just shook my head, holding up a hand to stop their questions. "Call Sheriff Brody," I said, my voice a dry rasp. "Just call him. Tell him to get down here." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unasked questions. Nobody moved for a second. Then young Pete Jensen fumbled for his phone and scurried away. The others just stared at me, then at the bait cooler sitting ominously on my deck. Sheriff Brody arrived in his dusty patrol car 10 minutes later. Brody is a good man, born and raised in Port Blossom, just like me. He's got a calm, steady demeanor that's usually enough to quell any small-town squabble. But when he saw the look on my face, his own easygoing expression tightened. "Mark, what in God's name happened?" he asked, walking down the pier. "They said you screamed like a man being murdered." "Worse, Brody," I choked out. "I think I found one." I led him onto the sea serpent, the boat rocking gently under our combined weight. My hands shook as I unlatched the cooler. I didn't want to look again, but I had to. I pulled out the canvas sack and untied the knot. Brody peered inside, and his face went pale, the ruddy, sun-weathered color draining away to a sickly gray. He was silent for a full minute, his professional calm battling with the raw human horror of what he was seeing. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he finally whispered, straightening up and taking a deep breath of the salt air, as if to clear his head. He looked at me, his eyes now hard and focused. "Tell me everything," I told him, "about the heavy net, the tangle of seaweed, the discovery, and then, the part that mattered most, the ring, the inscription." As I said Thomas Miller's name, a collective gasp went through the small crowd of onlookers who had crept closer to eavesdrop. The secret was out. Brody was all business now. He made a call, and soon the dock was swarming with a deputy and a medical examiner from the next county over. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, a jarring sight in our little fishing village. I gave my official statement, my words feeling hollow and inadequate. As they carefully bagged the cooler and loaded it into a vehicle, Brody put a hand on my shoulder. "I have to go tell Maria," he said, his voice grim. "It's my duty. But Mark, you were his friend, his neighbor. He didn't have to finish the sentence. He wanted me there, not as a witness, but as something. A buffer, maybe. A familiar face in the storm that was about to break over her life. I didn't want to go. I wanted to go home, lock my door, and drink until I couldn't remember the image of that pale, waterlogged hand. But I couldn't say no. We drove the short distance to the little yellow cottage in Brody's patrol car, the silence between us thick with dread. The prize-winning red roses were in full bloom along her white picket fence, their vibrant color almost mocking the grim purpose of our visit. Brody knocked on the door. It opened, and there was Maria. She was wearing a floral apron, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She was smiling, but the smile vanished when she saw Sheriff Brody's face, and then me, standing behind him like some grim omen. "Sheriff? Mark?" she said, her voice laced with confusion. "Is everything all right?" Brody was gentle, but direct. "Maria, can we come in? There's been a discovery. It concerns Thomas." We sat in her meticulously clean living room. It was filled with pictures of her and her parents, of her friends, but I noticed for the first time that there wasn't a single picture of Thomas anywhere. As Brody broke the news, explaining that human remains had been found and that they were believed to be her husband's, her reaction was strange. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse into sobs. Her face crumpled, yes, and tears welled in her eyes, but it felt like a performance. She brought a delicate hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with what looked like practiced shock. "Oh, my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My Thomas. After all this time. I thought he was happy. I thought he was alive." Brody asked her about the ring, describing it. She nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the flower on her cheek. "Yes," she confirmed. "That was his wedding band." I watched her, my gut twisting into a cold, hard knot. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. This wasn't the grief of a wife learning her husband was dead. This was the performance of a widow solidifying her alibi. After a few more questions, Brody decided it was enough for now. He told her they'd be in touch, and we left. As we walked back to the car, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the manicured lawn. I glanced back at the house. Maria was standing in the doorway, watching us go. Her face was no longer a mask of grief. It was perfectly, terrifyingly blank. Her eyes met mine, and for a fleeting second, I saw something in them. It wasn't sadness. It was cold, hard, calculating ice, and it was a look that said, "You have no idea what you've done." I finally got home as darkness fell, the events of the day playing over and over in my head like a nightmare on a loop. My little house by the water had never felt so lonely, so unsafe. I locked the front door, something I hadn't done in 20 years. Exhausted, I went to my workshop in the back to put away my gaff hook, the tool I'd used to uncover the horror in my net. I just wanted to feel normal for a second, to do something routine. I flipped on the single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling. The light flickered on, illuminating the familiar clutter of ropes, buoys, and tools, but on my workbench, right in the center, sat something that didn't belong. It was a fishing lure, one of the old wooden ones Thomas used to carve by hand. He'd given me a set of them for my birthday years ago. This one was laid carefully on a bed of fresh, damp seaweed, the same thick brown kelp I'd pulled from my net that morning, and stuck through the lure's treble hook, impaled like a warning, was a single, perfect, blood-red rose petal. The world narrowed to that single red petal. It was impossible. I hadn't been back to my house since I'd docked the boat. I'd gone straight from the pier to Maria's with Sheriff Brody. No one had been here. No one could have been here. But the seaweed was real, still slick and glistening under the weak light bulb, leaving a small dark puddle of seawater on the worn wood of my workbench. The air in the workshop, usually smelling of sawdust and engine oil, now carried the faint, foul odor of the deep, the same smell that had clung to my net. The rose petal was a deliberate punctuation mark, a splash of vibrant color against the grime, a signature, Maria's prize-winning roses. My blood turned to ice water. The lock on my front door felt useless now, a flimsy piece of metal against a threat that could seep through the cracks like the evening fog. She had been here, while I was with the sheriff, while the whole town was down at the docks gawking at my boat. She had been here. The thought was paralyzing. It wasn't just a threat. It was a demonstration. She was telling me she could get to me, that she was one step ahead. The blank, calculating look in her eyes as we left her house now made perfect, chilling sense. She wasn't a grieving widow. She was a cornered animal, and I had just kicked the cage. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night sitting in my worn armchair, a heavy tire iron resting on the floor beside me, jumping at every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind. The familiar sounds of my home had become menacing. By the time the first gray light of dawn broke through my window, I looked and felt like a ghost. I made a pot of coffee so strong it could dissolve a nail and tried to think. Going to Brody was my first instinct. But what would I say? I found a fishing lure on my workbench? He'd think I was losing my mind, spooked by the day's gruesome discovery. He'd say I'd probably left it there myself and forgotten. The seaweed. The rose petal. It was flimsy. It was the kind of thing a clever woman could easily deny, making me look like a paranoid old fisherman pointing fingers at a grieving widow. No, I needed more. I needed proof. I didn't take the sea serpent out that day. The thought of casting my nets into that water, of what else I might pull up, made my stomach turn. Instead, I walked. I walked the length of Port Blossom, from the boatyards to the market, watching, listening. The village was buzzing. The news of Thomas Miller's hand had spread like wildfire. The story was on everyone's lips. Hushed whispers in the general store, grim-faced discussions between fishermen mending their nets. The official story, the one being fed by Brody's office, was that a tragic accident had finally come to light. But the undercurrent was darker. People were remembering things. Old Man Hemlock mentioned how Thomas, who loved his boat more than anything, had suddenly stopped taking it out in the weeks before he left. Sarah from the bakery recalled Maria buying an unusual amount of lye around the same time, claiming she had a clog in her drains that just wouldn't clear. Separately, these were just bits of small-town trivia. Together they started to paint a picture, and it wasn't a pretty one. Thomas hadn't just left. He'd been erased. My walk eventually led me past their little yellow cottage. Maria was in the front yard, tending to her roses. She wore a black dress, the picture of mourning, but she moved with a calm, deliberate grace, snipping away dead leaves, her movements precise and unhurried. She didn't seem like a woman whose world had just been shattered. She looked like a gardener tending her plot. She must have felt my eyes on her, because she looked up, her gaze locking with mine from across the street. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just held my gaze, and then, very slowly, she raised a gloved hand and gave me a small, dismissive wave before turning back to her flowers. The message was clear. Keep walking. I knew I couldn't let it go. This was about more than just my fear. It was about Thomas. He had been my friend. We'd grown up together, learned to fish together, gotten drunk for the first time together. He was a simple, kind man who deserved better than to be packed away in pieces at the bottom of the sea. That evening I called Brody. "Mark," he answered, his voice weary. "What is it?" "I need to know what you found," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The rest of him. Are you searching?" There was a long pause. "The Coast Guard has a boat out," he said, his tone professional and guarded. "But Mark, the ocean is a big place. The currents could have taken anything, anywhere. We're doing what we can." "What about Maria?" I pressed. "Did you ask her about the lie? Did you ask her why she got rid of all his pictures?" "She has an answer for everything," Brody sighed, a hint of frustration creeping in. "The lie was for the drains. She has a receipt from the plumber who came out a week later and said they were still clogged. The pictures? She said it was too painful to look at them, that she put them in the attic to help her move on. Everything she says is reasonable. We have no cause to search her property, Mark. All we have is a hand. It's tragic, but it's not evidence of murder. He was right. She was smart. Careful. She had built her story brick by brick over the course of a year, and it was solid. But I knew. I knew in my bones what had happened. If Brody couldn't find anything, I would have to. That night I waited. I watched the lights in the yellow cottage go out one by one. I saw Maria's silhouette pass by the window, and then darkness. The village fell silent, wrapped in the thick coastal fog that had rolled in with the tide. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, I crept through the back alleys, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Her back garden was as immaculate as the front. The only thing out of place was a newly built tool shed at the far end of the property, its fresh pine scent cutting through the damp air. The shed was locked with a heavy-duty padlock. It looked new, expensive, out of place. I worked the crowbar into the jamb, praying the old wood would give before the metal of the lock. With a sickening splintering sound, the door popped open. I slipped inside, pulling the door closed behind me, and switched on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating bags of potting soil, shovels, rakes, all the usual garden tools. But against the back wall there was something else, a large chest freezer, the kind you keep in a garage to store extra meat. It was humming quietly, a low electric thrum that seemed to vibrate through the floor. A cold dread, sharper and more intense than anything I'd felt on the boat, washed over me. Why would she need a freezer this big out here in a shed? My hand trembled as I reached for the lid. It was cold, so cold it seemed to burn my fingertips. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I might find, and I lifted it. The interior light flickered on, revealing nothing. It was empty, spotlessly, bleach-clean empty. Not a single crumb, not a single frost crystal out of place. I felt a wave of confused relief, followed immediately by suspicion. It was too clean. I ran my flashlight beam over the interior, looking for any sign, any stain, any scratch. Nothing. I was about to close the lid to write it off as another dead end, when my light caught something on the thick, white rubber seal that ran around the rim. It was a tiny speck of darkness, almost invisible against the white. I leaned in closer, using the tip of a nail to gently scrape it loose. It was a small, dried fleck of something. I brought it closer to the light, my heart stopping in my chest. It wasn't dirt. It was dark, reddish-brown. It looked like dried blood. A noise outside made me freeze. The sound of a twig snapping. I instantly killed the flashlight, plunging the shed into absolute blackness. My ears strained, listening. Silence. Had I imagined it? I waited, my breath held tight in my lungs. And then I heard it. A soft, scraping sound, right outside the door. Someone was there, and they were locking me in. I heard the unmistakable, heavy clunk of the padlock being slid back into place. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. The clunk of the padlock echoed in the tiny shed, a sound of finality, the sound of a tomb being sealed. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. I was trapped. She knew. She had known I was coming. The lure on my workbench wasn't just a warning, it was bait. She had drawn me here. I scrambled for the door, my fingers fumbling in the pitch black for the handle. I pulled, I rattled, I slammed my shoulder against the splintered wood, but it was useless. The new padlock held fast. "Maria!" I yelled, my voice sounding weak and muffled. "I know you're out there. Let me out." There was no answer, only the soft whisper of the wind through the trees, and the incessant low hum of the empty freezer beside me. The freezer. My mind raced, trying to push through the terror, the speck of blood. It was my only proof. I carefully transferred the tiny flake from my fingernail into an empty pocket, zipping it shut. It felt pathetically small, a flimsy piece of hope against the solid reality of my prison. Then I smelled it. A faint, acrid scent, like gasoline. It was seeping in from under the door. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about trapping me. This was about erasing me, just like she had erased Thomas. I started to beat on the door with the crowbar, the metal clanging uselessly against the wood, the noise swallowed by the thick night air. The smell of gasoline grew stronger, overpowering. I could hear a liquid sloshing sound now, the sound of my coffin being prepared. "You won't get away with this," I screamed, a desperate, last-ditch defiance. A voice, calm and eerily conversational, answered from the other side of the door. "Oh, Mark," Maria said, her tone laced with a chilling pity. "I already have." I heard the scratch of a match, and then the world outside the shed erupted in a whoosh of orange light that flickered violently through the cracks in the door. Heat washed over me instantly. The quiet hum of the freezer was now joined by the hungry crackle of flames. Smoke, thick and black, began to pour in through the gaps in the walls. I choked, my lungs burning. This was it. This was how I would die, cooked in a shed behind the house of the woman who had murdered my friend. But as I stumbled back, away from the heat of the door, my foot hit something solid. The freezer. An idea, insane and desperate, sparked in my mind. It was my only chance. Using the last of my strength, fueled by adrenaline and terror, I wedged the crowbar under the freezer and heaved. It was monstrously heavy, but I wasn't just lifting a freezer. I was lifting my own gravestone. It tilted, scraped across the floor, and with a final agonizing push, it crashed onto its side. I threw open the lid again. The interior light was a beacon in the smoke-filled darkness. Without a second thought, I scrambled inside, pulling my jacket over my face. It was a ridiculously small space, a coffin of a different kind, but it was insulated. It was my only hope. I reached up, grabbed the edge of the heavy lid, and pulled it down. The world went black and silent, save for the muffled roar of the fire outside. The air inside the freezer was stale and cold, but it was clean. I lay there, curled in a fetal position, listening as the flames consumed the shed around me. The sound was terrifying, an infernal symphony of cracking wood and shattering glass. The freezer grew warm, then hot to the touch. The plastic lining began to feel tacky. I prayed. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. I thought of Thomas, of his easy laugh and his steady friendship. I thought of the village, of the sea, of the life I was about to lose. And then, mercifully, I must have passed out. I awoke to the sound of shouting and the hiss of water. The air was still thick and smelled of smoke and burnt plastic, but it was breathable. I pushed weakly at the lid above me. It didn't budge. I pushed again, harder, and this time it lifted slightly before being thrown open from the outside. Light, blessed and blinding, flooded in. A figure in a fireman's helmet was staring down at me, his face a mask of utter disbelief. "Holy," he stammered, "there's a man in the freezer." I was pulled out, coughing and gasping, onto the charred, waterlogged ground. The shed was gone, reduced to a blackened frame. Sheriff Brody was there, his face grim as he rushed to my side. "Mark! My God, we thought you were in there," he said, helping me to my feet. Maria," I coughed, my throat raw. "She locked me in. She tried to kill me." Brody's eyes hardened. "We know. Your neighbor, Old Man Hemlock, couldn't sleep. He saw the flicker of the fire and called it in. When we got here, Maria was standing right there," he said, gesturing to the picket fence, "just watching it burn. A can of gasoline at her feet. She didn't even try to run." They had her in the back of the patrol car. I looked over and saw her silhouette through the window. She was staring straight at me. Even from a distance I could feel the hatred radiating from her. Her perfect alibi, her carefully constructed new life, had literally gone up in smoke. The story came out in pieces over the next few weeks. The tiny fleck of dried blood from the freezer seal was a match for Thomas. It was all the proof they needed. Faced with that, and my testimony, Maria finally confessed. She hadn't loved Thomas. She'd loved his boat, his house, the security he offered. But she'd grown tired of him, of his simple ways and his quiet devotion. She'd met someone else online, someone who promised excitement and wealth. But she couldn't just leave Thomas. Under the law, he'd get half of everything. So she'd planned his murder with the same meticulous care she planned her garden. She had poisoned his dinner one night. Then, over the next 2 days, She used the tools in his own workshop to dismember his body. The freezer in the new shed was where she stored the pieces, wrapped in heavy-duty plastic bags, until she could dispose of them. She took his boat out, night after night, dropping the weighted bags into the deep channel, the very spot I always fished. She kept his hand as a final gruesome piece to get rid of, but a storm had blown in that night, and in her haste, the bag must have torn loose from its weight. She had written the fake letter, played the part of the grieving wife perfectly, and for over a year she had gotten away with it. Pulling his hand from the sea was the one thing she could never have planned for. My scream had been the beginning of her end. Port Blossom is a quiet town again. The little yellow cottage is empty now, the prize-winning roses withered and black on their stems. The story has become a local legend, a dark tale to be told when the fog rolls in thick from the sea. I still fish. I still pilot the sea serpent out into the grey dawn. But something has changed. I look at the water differently now. It's no longer just my livelihood. It's a partner, a keeper of truths. My father was right. The sea doesn't keep secrets. It holds them in its cold, dark depths. And sometimes, when you least expect it, it offers them up to the light. It gave me back my friend's hand, and with it, it gave him justice. The ocean has a memory, and in the end, it always remembers.